Domestic Employers Network. The workshop tonight is My Home is Someone's Workplace. I'm Amalia Torrentes, the Employer Education Consultant at Hand in Hand. My pronouns are she and her, and tonight we'll be presenting how to be a fair domestic employer. We'll cover industry standards, laws to comply with, employer tips, and share domestic worker perspectives. What sets Hand in Hand apart are the allies we partner with in order to shape the industry. This webinar is a result of our partnership with New York City government agencies such as the Department of Consumer Affairs and Worker Protection, the Commission on Human Rights, as well as domestic worker organizations such as the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and of course, employers represented in the Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employer Work Network. We are doing this webinar in honor of International Domestic Workers Day, which is celebrated June 16. We are starting the celebration tonight. And celebrating this is important because recognition of domestic work by lawmakers has happened due to the organizing of workers and the support of domestic employers. This is powerful. Before I introduce our amazing panel, I'm going to ask you, our attendees, to introduce yourselves.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Marisa Centeno. I am the National Domestic Workers Alliance New York Director, and I go by she, her. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all tonight.
Thank you, Marissa. And if our attendees can put in their name, their location, and your experience employing a person in your home. In honor of International Domestic Workers Day, please show your appreciation. And one question that you'd love to get answered, something you've been going through, thinking about, we'd love to hear from you. So I'm just gonna give it a minute for people to share in the chat. And Reha and Tatiana, you can introduce yourselves while we're waiting.
Hi, my name is Rhea. I go by pronouns she and her. I live in Queens with my 2 kids, and I am a member of Hand in Hand.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tatiana Bejar, and Hand in Hand New York City lead organizer. Very excited to be here tonight as we are relaunching our education project with domestic employers and always in partnership with our sister organization, the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Please don't be shy. This is your space. We want to know where you're coming from. We want to know your experience with domestic work. We want to know who you're employing. And if you just want to give a shout out to the person that you employ, to show your appreciation to domestic workers. And again, if you want to share any questions that you have. For this webinar, we've invited experts in the industry, Marissa Centeno from the National Domestic Workers Alliance New York Director, Reha Sturbin, Employer Leader with Hand in Hand, and Tatiana Behar, Hand in Hand New York Lead Organizer. As you continue to share your appreciation for domestic workers and your questions, Marissa will share some remarks about the international treaty that makes International Domestic Workers Day possible and what it means to us here in New York. Marissa?
Good evening, everyone. Here at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we have like one holiday that we get really, really excited about. And we want more people to know about this holiday, and it is the International Domestic Workers Day. We love to celebrate in our chapter. Tomorrow, we're actually hosting an event in Washington Square Park. So if you happen to be there in the area between 10 and 12, please stop by and say hello, bring your kiddos. But just to give you a little bit of an introduction, domestic workers have been organizing to win increased protections at the state, federal, and international level for generations. And for anyone that's ever taken an interest, let's say, in the civil rights movement, in feminist movements, in movements of people of color, I really highly suggest like doing some research around domestic worker-led movements, and they have like some powerful stories and really have been the backbone to some of our more popularized movements in this country. Ones that we imagine were led by Dr. Martin Luther King. You know, we wonder who were the women who went on strike on the bus strikes and stopped taking the buses to work. Those were domestic workers. So once you dig a little deeper, you see that there's a very strong history within our country. And since domestic work is a globalized workforce, really this is like has a global history. So June 16th marks the anniversary of the passage of the International Labor Organization Convention 189. And it's the Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers. So there is an international ILO convention across the globe that has standards for domestic workers that should be upheld all across the globe. And in the US, we're celebrating by building support for our campaigns to win rights for dignity for domestic workers, including our National Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. If you don't know, New York State was the very first state in the entire country to pass a domestic worker bill of rights. So right there, you're sort of rooted in, in us like leading history, leading the way, and really making like significant headway as to what's possible for building a collective care future, right? And then even really taking this to like a global level. There's close to 2.5 million domestic workers in the US and over 70 million domestic workers globally. And so you all in this space know very well intimately that domestic work makes your work possible, makes your ability to go to work as the nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers are helping all of us really run our homes and support our families. And domestic workers are a majority Black, Latinx, and Asian, and Indigenous women and immigrant women. And domestic workers, as we know, work in isolation behind closed doors and are subject to unsafe and uncertain working conditions. Issues like sexual harassment, exploitation, and disrespect are often a rule rather than an exception. And I think that the conversations had in this space with employers, with Hand in Hand, in collaboration with domestic workers is like not only important, but it's you know, quite revolutionary, radical. No one really, that didn't occur to a lot of people to bring employers and employees together in such a way. And so we're really happy that we get to have this space in connection with each other. Globally, International Domestic Workers Day is celebrated every year on June 16th. And its passage of the Convention 189 in 2011 was a historic international step to establishing fundamental labor protections for domestic workers across the globe. And since its passage, 32 countries have ratified the convention. And for countries that haven't ratified, domestic workers are still working to have their countries adopt the ILO Convention 189. When in 2013, the ILO and this collaboration of domestic worker organizations formalized an International Domestic Workers Federation. It's the first and only global union federation led by and made up primarily of women, with 67 affiliated domestic worker organizations in 54 different countries. So this is a very powerful force. And every year, you know, they come to New York and they have meetings held at the UN, host meetings across the globe, and really collaborate and share strategies like around how they're organizing domestic workers globally. And for example, we were lucky enough to meet with a couple of representatives from the ILO, the International Domestic Workers Federation, one from Tanzania, and another from a person who was living in Lebanon, and another from Kenya. And the woman from Kenya has a union that is like 30,000 domestic workers strong, and then has chats, like WhatsApp chats in different parts of the world of Kenyans who are trying to communicate with other domestic workers, with herself as the leader of her union, around how to address, different working conditions in different countries across the globe. And she's able to maintain communications with all of these people and them with each other. So it's a source of not only communication, but support and understanding that they have the backing of each other. It's really impressive. Like we had an amazing time just like getting to talk strategy, but it also shows like the interconnectedness. And they, were so interested to hear what we were doing here in New York, wanted to know more about the recent wins in the human rights law for New York City, wanted to know more about how we were collaborating with employers and taking up campaigns together, and wanted to better understand like the structure of our organization. And also we're trying to understand, why is it domestic workers can't unionize in this country when in other countries they can? So these were big questions and like even just small questions. It's so fascinating and such a really great way to understand like our global economy, but it has such a personal, individual impact on each and every one of us. So I'll just finish off with saying that here in the US and in New York, so at a national level, we're fighting to and advocating for a passage of a federal domestic worker bill of rights. And much of that was modeled after the New York State Bill of Rights. What we do in our states and the wins that we have make it so that we can better understand what's possible at a national level. And it would be its first national legislation to create a strong rights and workplace protections for domestic workers all across the country, right? And so we're very excited to like relaunch that Federal Bill of Rights campaign, but at the same time, really in maintaining that New York can lead the way in some very revolutionary and progressive movement building and raising of standards. So thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. We're excited to have this webinar as part of International Domestic Workers Day. We celebrate domestic workers. Your work is essential for all our homes and our city. So our goals for today is going to be to discuss legal requirements and industry standards, connect domestic worker and employer perspectives, analyze different workplace scenarios. So again, this is your space. So if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to use the chat. If you want to reach out to us directly, our email contact is on every PowerPoint. Our email is nycsupport@domesticemployers.org. I'm going to pass it on to Reha, who's going to be speaking about her experience as an employer. Reha, you have the floor.
Hi, my name is Rhea Sturban. I am an employer of a nanny, and I have been part of Hand in Hand for about 5 years. I'm so happy to be here. I am happy to share my story and some useful tips that help me figure out how to be a fair employer. So the Fair Care Pledge is a commitment that employers make to affirm that we will do our best to be fair and respectful employers when we're hiring somebody in our home. This is so important to me because it shows that I value the person who is caring for my family and allows them to do their work. and allows me to do my work. A pillar of any relationship is good communication. Good communication. We want to provide living wages and paid time off, sick leave, and other benefits. A lot of times, this is going to mean not just complying with the law, but also going beyond the law. At Hand in Hand, we found that through conversations with both employers and employees, that there are 3 important things to remember to foster a respectful relationship with those that we hire. And those make up the Fair Care Pledge: clear communication, fair pay, and paid time off. So I have been in the trenches trying to figure this stuff out for myself. When my son was born, I had no friends who had children, and I didn't know anything about hiring a nanny. And I was very lucky that I had a friend who was a nanny and who was able to give me some guidance. And the most important thing that she said to me was, remember that you want caring for your children to be a good job, the kind of job that you would want to have. And so that's really where I started. But it's not always easy to figure out what the right thing to do is. So the first thing to do is, during the hiring process, you have to start with having very clear expectations, knowing exactly what the job responsibilities are going to be. You want to be on the same page with the person that you're employing about what you want for your home and for your family. It helps a lot to make a point-by-point work agreement. With my nanny, we have an employment contract that we put together, we talked through, and made sure that we were both on the same page before we signed it. This sets the right expectations, and it sets expectations for how the relationship will progress. So, I laid out from the beginning, like, these are the paid holidays that are going to be coming up. This is how much sick leave is going to be available. What happened, what am I going to expect if you're running late, or if there's a need for you to cancel and not come at all that day. That is really important, to set the right expectations. And so that, there's not a moment where, I'm expecting her to do one thing and she's expecting to do something else. That contract is a great starting point, but you have to follow it up with really, really good communication, and very often. If I don't communicate well, I am going to miss something that's important for my family. But I also just want to check in and make sure that everything is working smoothly, that it's working for both of us. It's really important to have a specific time that we're going to check in. It helps a lot to put in writing so that these are the days that we're going to check in, and we're going to have an opportunity to talk about anything that might need a little bit of tweaking. Your work agreement reflects how you and the domestic worker that you employ are going to comply with the law requirements. Amalia is going to talk about the laws in a lot more in depth later on. But part of your responsibility under the law is that you need to pay your employee responsibly. I know that I would certainly be extremely unhappy if my employer did not pay me on schedule and a fair wage. And it's the right thing to do, obviously, but also the Department of Labor is going to be looking at your records. So you need to keep records of hours they worked, what deductions you made for the appropriate taxes, what wages they earned. That work agreement will set the schedule for work and what the details for payment are going to be. Nowadays, the minimum wage is generally not enough, and we need to pay a living wage. The recommendation is at least $21 per hour. And that's going to depend on, the number of children and the responsibilities. We know that communities of color are most impacted during economic downturns. We are all affected by inflation, but the workers that we employ are going to be impacted more. Paying a living wage, paying on time, and paying reliably will go a long way in terms of keeping your employee happy and valued and respected. So paid time off. Everyone needs to take a vacation every now and then. It's important to have that downtime. Hand in Hand recommends 2 weeks of vacation. All of the best employers will give time off, especially in these days, as stressful as everything has been. We all are going to need some time to heal. Furthermore, we're living in a pandemic, and we all know what it means to have tested positive. We are witnessing increased violence in addition to the impact of COVID-19 and the economic downturn in our lives. We're all affected, but communities of immigrant women of color are impacted more. By law, employers must give at least 40 hours of paid sick time, but you should also allow your employee to take a mental health day if that's what's needed. As employers, we have to care about the well-being of our employees, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because it affects our homes. Someone who feels valued is going to show their appreciation through their work. I find that keeping open lines of communication and making it very clear that, that Lupe is able to take time if she needs to take time. I am always going to be okay with that. That has made a huge difference. If she needs to take some time off to go to the doctor, absolutely. I will, I can come up with ways to cover that. There's always going to be some sort of solution. We understand the social and economic context in which domestic employers work. So let's take some time to reflect, what is your own experience? How do you expect your employer to support you in your own workplace? So it may be hard to figure out what we should be doing as employers, but I ask myself, just as my friend Ham told me when I was first getting started, what is going to make me feel valued and respected by my employer, and pass that on. Something to think about. I would encourage you to go ahead and use the chat to answer these questions. These are really great things to discuss with each other. What has been important to you as an employee, and what was there compensation or benefits or how you were treated? Was there effective communication? Were there check-ins? What makes you feel valued at work? So when so during COVID-19, I was working from home. My husband was working from home, and we continued to be paid. We were able to isolate and stay safe, and I wanted that same experience for Lupe. So we had shuffled things around a little bit to make it so that she didn't need to be on public transit. And then when it seemed like that was not even going to work out, we agreed that she would be home on paid leave for a while, and then we checked in frequently. We set up some video calls so that she could spend time with the kids as well. And we just checked in periodically and looked at how safe things were. Once things started to get a little bit better, and we knew that remote schooling was going to be part of the deal, we talked about it, and she got a pay raise because she was going to be doing a lot more work with the remote schooling involved. And we needed to arrange our schedules because she had her own responsibilities to her own family. She has a younger sister, and her younger sister was also doing remote school. So, she's older, she's in high school. So she wanted to get her sister set up for the day and then come with us. And then she would help with the rest of the school day and homework. And then she would go home in time to check in with her sister again. And it was important for us to have that communication and talk about what was going to work for our family, but also for her family. What was going to make us all feel safe and respected, and that we were being treated fairly. So I want to pass it back to Amalia now.
Thank you, Reha. It's always great to hear directly from employers who know from experience the journey of becoming a fair employer. I'm just going to stop and check the chat box to see who's here. Liz is from Brooklyn. Thank you for being here, Liz. And for shouting out your domestic worker. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Namrata, for being here from Adhikar. That's amazing. Thank you for making time for being here. Thank you, Reha. Thank you for being part of our panel. And Rebecca from Ithaca. That's awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Sahira, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time, and we hope that you're enjoying this. We have so much more in store. So one of the tools Reha talked about was an agreement, and your agreement is going to be like your employee handbook. We all know what it's like to work for someone who doesn't give a lot of direction, feedback, or has communicated expectations. A fair employer will have these things in place, and the sample agreements developed by Hand in Hand will have a concrete plan on how to comply with labor laws and provide space to outline basic information like start dates, responsibilities, a space to establish an open and respectful communication, like scheduling, planning for when somebody is running late, to handle grievances. It will also give you an opportunity to define wages and human resource policies like pay schedule, yearly increases, reimbursement policies, and letters of recommendation. You also want to designate, as Ray has said, paid time off. We're talking about vacation and paid safe and sick time. And lastly, the agreement will give you a space to establish, will give you a space to establish a healthy workplace by creating a non-toxic and safe workplace and have protocols in place for COVID-19. So I wanted to ask Marissa, what agreements mean to workers and what significance does it have?
Absolutely. I think we talked to thousands of workers, and agreements and check-ins as well as contracts really mean that there is like an open and honest communication, right? You're not leaving unsaid things on the table. And for domestic workers, they don't have coworkers. You are their coworker, and you're their employer, right? It's a little awkward sometimes, but and in many ways, it's a professional relationship of co-parenting, right? And so just like any co-parenting for nannies or co-management of a household, or co-caring for a loved one, right? There just has to be a lot of communication that gets updated, that is certainly shared, but also an agreement is something that workers can rely on, right? Because if there is a misunderstanding, if there is something that needs to be worked out, that's sort of like your base. Like, I love the way they said that it was like your employee handbook, right? I can go back to that and say, this isn't really what we had discussed before, or I'm seeing that there's some changes either in work practices or workload, or maybe things that need to be updated as work conditions change. You know, for example, children grow and they have different needs, or familial needs might grow, or maybe a house cleaner, like the house cleaning needs might change. And really having that agreement lets you kind of like go back and say, what was the base and what do we need to move forward? I think, but we know that for workers, when there is a space for this type of professional conversation, it really minimizes the misunderstandings, and it minimizes the opportunities for there to be, you know, even like resentment, but also the ability to make improvements and to really work together on the long term.
Thank you, Marissa. Seems like this document is gold, and you're probably wondering, how do you get your hands on this document? You can simply send us an email or fill out the link that Tatiana is going to be putting in the chat box. So what exactly do we mean by complying with the law? Labor laws exist to protect workers. Prior to 2010, there weren't any protections for domestic workers. Thanks to the organizing between domestic workers and employers, domestic workers are now protected. As a result, employers are now visible and are able to get more support from organizations such as Hand in Hand and government agencies. There is a notion that domestic work isn't real, but they are now recognized under the law, and that helps legitimize their work. Domestic work is real work, and they are real workers who are worthy of being treated as employees with benefits. We have heard stories of workers being paid $5 an hour, working up to 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning for special events and not seeing any increase in pay. Stories of workers who get sexually abused or fired because they are pregnant. So yes, all these things happen in the industry, which is why these laws are important. Each of the following workplace laws could be on its own 2-hour webinar, and I will give you a quick overview. If you have any questions or if you want to know more about any of these laws, please reach out to me. It's important for you to be aware of what the law holds you responsible for. Sometimes you will need to provide a notice of rights, write a policy regarding a benefit, or purchase an insurance policy. So let's start off with the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. This is pretty much the Bible for domestic workers' rights, and it provides protections under the state labor laws, protections for wages, overtime, getting a disability insurance policy, and paying unemployment. Employers need to have all of this in place. The Domestic Worker Bill of Rights also includes the New York State Paid Family Leave, which provides 12 weeks paid time off for workers to bond with their child, take care of a sick family member, or to assist a loved one when a family member is deployed abroad or on active military service. The New York City Paid Safe and Sick Leave provides workers 40 hours of paid leave, and employers must have a policy in place separate from the agreement. Everyone knows about sick leave, but I really want to talk about safe leave. Safe leave is designated for any safety measures an employee or their family have to take if they are a victim of domestic violence, unwanted sexual contact, stalking, or human trafficking. We'll be talking about this more specifically on June 29th at 8 p.m. at our next seminar to talk in detail about what the law requires. The last one we want to talk about is the New York City Human Rights Law, provides protection for discrimination-free workplace. Employers must provide a notice of rights, and we will be going more in depth later in this presentation about this law. Not complying with these laws could mean that you are subject to an investigation, or you may have to pay fines. So let's see how these law applies by sharing 2 scenarios. So our first scenario is Linda has just recently hired a nanny. Linda is running late from work and will arrive 30 minutes later than usual. The nanny Linda employs calls to find out when she will arrive home. Linda arrives late, and as a result, the nanny is late to pick up her children. At the end of the week, the nanny sees the same pay without any compensation for the 30 minutes that she was required to stay later. So how can this scenario be improved? You can use the chat box to just put in your ideas about what you would do. So we may think that it's not a big deal to be late just one time, but if it isn't addressed properly, it may continue to happen, and then your worker relationship will be strained and the worker will not be paid for their time. So you want to communicate and plan for these scenarios ahead of time. You want to communicate to let the employee know you'll be late, compensate the employee for every minute worked, and also consider paying the full hour if you're 30 minutes late. We even heard of employers paying taxi as additional compensation. The Department of Labor requires you to keep records of hours worked and wages. Domestic workers are encouraged to document their hours if their employer doesn't do it, but it's the employer's responsibility. Lastly, do not bank hours. Do not say, sorry. Do not say, oh, well, last week I came home early and I let you leave. Why can't you stay a little later today? You can't store hours and ask your employee to pay them late. You can't store your hours and ask your employee to pay them later. The fair and right thing to do is if your employee is working, then you must pay them. So I want to ask Reha if this has ever happened to you. Have you ever run late? And what did you do?
Okay, so I have definitely run late before. It's the most important thing, obviously, is to communicate in advance. In our first interview before I hired Lupe, like I let her know that I have pretty bad ADHD and I'm not always aware that time is passing. And I want to make sure that I'm as respectful as possible. And so if she doesn't hear from me, I definitely appreciate getting a text that says, hey, what's going on, so that I can, fill her in, and it's going to alert me that I need to get myself moving. Obviously, if I realize that I'm running late, I always text in advance. And any extra time that she works, obviously I pay for. We typically round up to the nearest 15 minutes, but obviously if the later that's, the more I am, I'm interested in rounding up. I do all of our payroll and taxes and everything through a separate system that handles a lot of that for me. And one of the nice things about it is that it allows Lupe to go in and mark down what her hours were for that week. And all I have to do is take a look at the end, and I know that it's always going to be correct because I trust her. But it's also going to be more correct than what I would come up with thinking about it, because I don't remember very much. So I like to make sure that she is in charge of, saying like, this is the time that I worked, and that I am confirming, rather than me saying this is the time that you worked, because I probably don't remember anywhere near as well as she does.
Thank you, Reha. That was great. I want to remind everybody, if you have questions as we're talking about these things, please pop them in to the chat. We can probably answer them while we're going along in the presentation, or we'll save some time at the end for questions and answers. We're going to go on to the second scenario. So Jessica is a domestic worker you employ to clean your home. She comes every weekend to clean for 5 hours for a total of 20 hours of work a month. Jessica has worked for you for 1.5 years, and she has never taken a sick day, but has now come down with symptoms of COVID-19 and misses work. She didn't come into work, and she didn't call until Monday morning. What do you do? So you can pop in your responses if you have an idea about what you would do. A lot of the time, employers view house cleaners as gig workers, when really, if they steadily come to your home to clean, they're actually your employees. As so, they are entitled to paid safe and sick leave. Start off by talking about what your safe and sick leave policies are, and also your COVID-19 policies, and set expectations. Put it in writing. Second, decide if you will provide these hours up front, or if your worker will earn it as they work. We recommend you provide leave hours up front, and this way you don't have to keep up tracking with accrual time or how much leave they're earning every time they come into work. In Jessica's example, the employee will work approximately 240 hours in a year, and this will merit 8 hours of paid safe and sick leave. You can be more generous, taking into account COVID-19 and citywide emergencies. So Jessica has already earned her paid safe and sick leave, and because she's worked 1.5 years, she can use it. She can use her earned time, and she also called as soon as she could. The law protects her from getting fired for taking a sick day when she has the hours available to her. Jessica should be paid her wages, and you should also check in with her regarding her health, because it will affect your home. So Marissa, I wanted to ask you if you see this issue come up with house cleaners.
Yes, of course. House cleaning can be one of those sectors of domestic work that can fluctuate a lot, right? Because um, between cleaning one person's home, the house cleaner might have 4 to 6 or even more different employers, and so it's a lot to manage, right? And imagine, someone working a full work week, if not more, in order to make a livable wage, and collectively not actually having access to paid sick leave because of the inherent structure to the work that they do as house cleaners. And this doesn't have to be the case. It's not the case. It's not the case. I think it really goes back to what can be done with agreements, with open communication, and with workers themselves understanding when they can take, when they have the ability to take sick leave. It is really healthier, better for not only the worker, but for the family they're working for as well. Because when someone can take the appropriate time to heal, and or do something that is falls under the safe portion of the safe and sick leave, we have less instability, and workers, especially women of color, over time aren't losing as much wages as they normally do. And really that has a huge effect on our communities overall. So it's a really overlooked issue, and I love that you brought this up today.
Thank you, Marissa. Fantastic. So let's dig into the New York City human rights law. Prior to 2022, domestic workers were only protected against sexual harassment. For all other discrimination protections, there needed to be 4 workers in the household. Now they are covered under all categories, and every single domestic worker in New York City is covered, regardless of how many employees work in the home. Yes. Discrimination is a sensitive topic. No one wants to think that they discriminate. As women, we can identify with being treated unequally to men. We know that men get paid more for doing the same job as women. The words that come to mind are unfair and demeaning. Maybe you haven't experienced discrimination, but perhaps a family member has. I remember my first experience with discrimination was when my mother was in the hospital and the doctor didn't know I spoke English. He asked my mother if she had crossed the border and if she was here illegally. What did that have anything to do? What did that have anything to do with her operation? The truth is, discrimination doesn't feel good and it's harmful, especially when it exists in your home. Perhaps having someone in your home of a different cultural or racial background creates curiosity. Many children ask about African American hair, and that's beautiful to be exposed and ask questions in a respectful way. But when its derogatory comments are made, it becomes discrimination. So let's define discrimination. Discrimination is unfavorable or unfair treatment of an individual or group based on identity labels such as race, ethnicity, skin color, immigration status, religion, age, gender, physical or mental ability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. This is a sensitive topic, but let's be open to asking questions and having a conversation about how we can combat our own prejudices and have a discrimination-free workplace. So I'm going to share some examples of illegal practices by employers. So an employer tells an undocumented worker that if they report discrimination, the employer will call ICE. An employer fires a pregnant worker because the employer thinks that they could not do the job while pregnant. An employer asks a worker to remove their hijab because it makes the family uncomfortable. An employer makes inappropriate sexual comments to a worker and tells them that if they report sexual harassment, they will never work again. All these things are not fair, they aren't correct or moral, but most importantly, they are not legal. A worker can submit a complaint to the New York City Human Rights Commission. Let's talk about reasonable accommodations. A reasonable accommodation is a change made to a work schedule or duties of an employee to accommodate their specific needs and allow them to do their jobs. So an example of an accommodation for domestic violence would be allowing the worker for time off to obtain an order of protection. For religion, it may be providing breaks to pray or leave for observances. For disability, a disability accommodation may include modifying some job tasks to accommodate a lifting restriction, time off to get medical treatment for a disability, for example, pregnancy. One key thing to remember about reasonable accommodations is that you must have an interactive communication and not dismiss the worker's request. Keep communication open, review the request, and see if you are able to grant it or think of other solutions to meet their needs. So we'll be talking about sexual harassment. So you can read the definition of sexual harassment here. Some examples of sexual harassment include asking a domestic worker you employ to watch a rated R movie, walk around naked in your home while your employee is there, having inappropriate posters or images, asking for sexual favors. The worker you employ must receive a notice of their rights upon hire regarding sexual harassment being illegal. Many times, because you are in your home and behind closed door, it gives a sense that there aren't any boundaries, but it's your responsibility as an employer not to engage or allow sexual harassment in your home as a domestic employer. Sexual harassment is never okay. And if a worker feels uncomfortable, they should tell an organizer like NWA or CGA or call the Commission on Human Rights. These scenarios are real. They come from real stories of domestic workers. So we know that these things happen and we want to make sure that we're aware of these things and creating a proper workplace. The last thing we want to talk about is making sure that domestic workers are free from retaliation. That means that if they put in a request for a reasonable accommodation, if they're talking about their rights, if they're telling other people about their rights, if they told you they filed a complaint, you cannot fire them, you cannot treat them differently, you cannot verbally or physically abuse them, you cannot badmouth them, or decrease their hours. Man, that was a lot of information. So let's pause to digest and take some questions. I will ask our panelists to help out in answering any questions you may have. Does anybody have any questions in the chat? This is your time to ask any questions. We're just going to take a few minutes. I know there was a lot of information that was shared. Tatiana said you can also raise your hand. Those are a lot of laws, guys, that we discussed. Somebody must have a question about one of these laws. Does anybody have a comment about the webinar? Is there anything else that you would like to know?
Maybe one question to ask the audience is like, if they've never had some of these conversations before, would they feel comfortable starting to have them? And in what order? Some of these are pretty heavy. Maybe what order would you start off and work yourself up to? It's like talking to teenagers about sex. Like, you got to start somewhere, but you got to have the conversations.
It's a must. And that's a great question, Marissa. Thank you for sharing that. So if one of the things that we do talk about is employers feeling lost or not knowing like where to start in this industry. And so we're definitely here to help for that. And you can say like, this is really great information. I plan on starting here. Or I'm really struggling with this. Can you help me with that? Because I mean, there isn't a lot of resources for domestic employers. And a lot of times, often when you call for help, people don't even know what a domestic employer is or a domestic worker is. So we want to make sure that we are addressing your question. So I have a question. Do overtime requirements apply? Yes, they do. So domestic workers are entitled to overtime after 40 hours of work, and they get paid at time and a half. Thank you. Thank you for that question. I know sometimes it can come as a surprise that all these laws apply to workers, but they do, and all these laws they fought to apply for domestic workers because they were excluded from the law. So yes, overtime was one law that was changed as part of the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. Okay, any of these apply even if people pay off the books? Great question. So yes, the only one that probably will not apply, that depends if they have work status, is unemployment, but everything else will apply. You can report your taxes. It does, even if you're paying off the books, like it's not illegal to pay cash. You can pay your worker cash. It is illegal if you don't report that to the IRS. Also, you can get a policy for workers' compensation. You can get a policy for paid family leave and workers' compensation. It doesn't matter what their status is, or if you're paying off the books, you can still get a policy for those things. So yeah, there are a lot of also paid safe and sick leave. It doesn't matter what the status is, you have to provide paid safe and sick leave. Also, like the federal laws about banking, you still cannot ask the worker to, like a lot of times during COVID-19, they paid the worker and then they were like, well, you have to make up that time, and they made them work extra time. You can't do that. If the worker is working, you pay them, and if you're being generous and you're letting them stay home, you can't ask them to make up the time ahead of time. So that's a great question. These laws do apply, most of them. Like I said, the only one you may have to look into is unemployment, because they need a social security for that. But everything else, you can buy a policy for disability, you can buy a policy for paid family leave and workers' compensation, you can provide paid safe and sick leave, and most definitely you can provide a discrimination-free workplace. We know that there is to be paid overtime, but why they need to make up hours also in the weekends with, why they need to make up hours also on the weekends with the same rate. However, some of our workers are entitled to work on the weekend. There should strictly enforce. Yes, you're absolutely right, Namrata. They're entitled to overtime, and they shouldn't be made to work the weekends to make up that time.
That's true. That is a very, just to add, it's a strong misconception, right? That you work back time, right? When you go to the office, if you're sick, you're generally not told to come back on a Sunday, right? Maybe if you're a high level lawyer and you're making those big bucks, you got to come in on a Sunday, but that's not generally what is a practice for regular wage an hour earners, right? And it also it speaks to like the value of care, right? When care is gendered and we are able to like devalue care work, it like falls back on us. I'm like, wait, I'm the caregiver in my household. My work should also be valued. Like it has value, even though, you know, I might not be paid as the mother caring for my own child, but it has value, and it should be shared. And if it's someone that I have to pay to help share that, we're thinking in terms of like the value of the actual work that is done. So work back hours is a common misconception, and I think that we can work together to really change that cycle.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Marissa, and thank you for everybody who asked the question. I appreciate that. And next, Tatiana, do you want to do the last scenario, or do you want to go on to the closing?
I think we should go to closing just to respect people's time, because we announce ended at 9. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to pass it on to you.
No, Great. Well, this has been really a very, very important conversation that we should happen more often. We know that the reason that we have now so many protections, that we have advanced domestic workers' rights, has been because domestic workers and employers have been organizing together. We are part of the domestic worker movement, and we have just even recently this photo that you see here, a really historic victory of ending the exclusion of domestic workers from the New York City human rights law. And that was just last year. So this is great. I know I'm sure there are many more questions. We will continue organizing webinars, but before we end, I also wanted to talk a little bit about Hand in Hand. We are the national network of employers of nannies, house cleaners, and home attendants. We believe that it benefits everyone when our homes are workplaces that are just, are kind, and unfair. And Hand in Hand was actually founded in 2010 by domestic employers who drew on their own experiences of confusion and isolation, just like probably many of you, in trying to figure out how to be good employers. We know that in the domestic work sector, the relationships that we form with workers in our homes is one of deep interdependence, and we need each other. And I see in the beginning how many of you were appreciating the person you employ at home, right? As we are starting celebrating International Domestic Workers Day. And one of the things that we don't also talk is that there are many more domestic employers in the country than we think. Just in New York State, a few years Hand in Hand research shows that there are over 2.7 million households that employ a nanny, a regular in-home childcare, home attendant, or house cleaner. So it's really like a big community of domestic employers, but people don't talk about that, right? We normally, when we go out and we not try to organize employers recruit, people don't want to say that they are an employer. They don't employ someone at home. So part of our work as Hand in Hand is to bring, right, those employers, to bring those practices behind closed doors into the light and help employers be good employers, and also organize them alongside domestic workers to transform this sector. As we have seen, this sector has transformed since the last decades towards to one that is becoming more fair, sustainable, and accessible to everyone. There are a few things. If we could go to the next slide, Amalia. So besides being a good employer and being responsible in implementing these practices we just shared, like how the Fair Care Pledge, for example, one of the things you could do is to sign the Fair Care Pledge. I don't know if Amalia, you could share it in the chat box. It's just affirming your commitment in believing that these employment practices is creating a workplace that is fair, and as we know, also a workplace that is free from discrimination. Right. Something else that you could also do is that in addition to be a good employer, you could be an ally, right, in this sector, and can join us in the New York City Coalition for Domestic Work, which is a coalition that we launched a year ago. It's led by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Hand in Hand, ADICAR, and Carroll Gardens Association. Together, we won this recent victory of incorporated domestic workers under the New York City Human Rights Law. Right now, we are fighting to get a budget from City Council that will provide programs for outreach and education for domestic workers and employers. Again, I mean, we're talking about probably in New York City over 1 million domestic employers, 200,000 domestic workers. Definitely, we need an infrastructure. We need the government to really take this sector seriously. Everyone speaks about this, right? All our politicians have a care story they want to share during the elections. But when they are in power, then we don't hear about that. We become invisible again, right? We need to change that. One way to do it is by joining us, becoming a member of Hand in Hand, whether you support our work. If you're an employer, an ally, you can become a member. We're a nonprofit organization, so definitely our member supporters and sustainers, a really contribution is very important. You can become a member by $5 a month. If you're a worker, I definitely encourage you to become a member of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. At the end, we are really a community. a community of parents, a community of women. No, this is a community that really inspires so much commitment and passion. This is when we meet with all our different backgrounds, our experiences, right? This is where racial justice, gender justice, immigrant justice really meets. No, this is the way in which we want to really change our city. We see how it's increasing really like conservative agendas, no, more violence as we see is increasing. And we know that women of color, immigrant women of color are the ones who are gonna be more targeted. So our way as Hand in Hand is not only like, okay, we're educating domestic employers, we're really transforming with alongside domestic workers this city. So I invite you to join us. Really excited to be in this webinar. We continue doing that and continue growing our family and our movement of domestic workers and employers. And I hope to see you next time at our meeting. I think, yeah, you can stay in touch. And I pass it over to you, Amalia, because this has been great. And I want you to do the final words.
Thank you, everybody, for joining and for all of the great questions that you had. Thank you to our panelists, Marissa, Reha, and Tatiana, for being here tonight and for sharing such great information. Join us if on Monday, I'm going to be having open hours for employers on Monday from 12 to 1 p.m. If anybody has any questions, wants to share their scenarios, we want to make space for employers. And also at the end of the month, on June 29th, we will be having another seminar. So please join us, and thank you all for coming. Happy International Domestic Workers Day, and looking forward to the rally tomorrow and to the celebration.